जय गोपीचन वल्लभा गिरिवरधारी, जय गोपीचन वल्लभा गिरिवरधारी, यशोदनंदन व्रज जनरंजन, यशोदनंदन व्रज जनरंजन, यमुनतीरा वनचारी, यमुनतीरा वनचारी, जय राधा माधव कुंज विहारी, जय राधा माधव कुंज विहारी, जय गोपीचन वल्लभा गिरिवरधारी, जय गोपीचन वल्लभा गिरिवरधारी, यशोदानंदन व्रज जनरंजन, यशोदानंदन व्रज जनरंजन, यमुनतीरा वनचारी, यमुनतीरा वनचारी, जय राधा माधव कुंज विहारी, हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे, हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे, हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे, हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे, हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे, हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे, हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे, हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम राम हरे हरे, हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम राम हरे हरे, हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे, हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे, जय प्रभुपदा जय प्रभुपदा, जय प्रभुपदा श्रील प्रभुपदा, जय प्रभुपदा जय प्रभुपदा, जय प्रभुपदा श्रील प्रभुपदा, जय ओम विष्णुपाद परमहंस चक्र विरक्त स्तुत सदस्य श्रीमन स्वयं ग्रह भक्तिवेदांत स्वामी शील बहुपाद की जय, इस्कॉन संस्थापक शील बहुपाद की जय, जय ओम विष्णुपाद परमहंस चक्र विरक्त स्तुत सदस्य श्रीमन भक्ति सिद्धांत सरस्वती गोस्वामी महाराज प्रभुपाद की जय। जय ओम विश्वास लकुर किशोरदास बाबू महाराज की जय। जय ओम विश्वास सच्चानंद श्री मुक्ति ठाकुर की जय। जय ओम विश्वास वैष्णव सार्वभौम श्री जगन्नाथ दास बाबू महाराज की जय। जय श्री रूप सनातन भट्ट रघुनाथ श्री जी गोपाल भट्टदास अविनाश गोस्वामी प्रभु की जय। नमाचार्य श्रीदास ठाकुर की जय। प्रेम से गोशीप चैतन्य गोपाल त्याग दास श्री द्वैत दादर शिवसादि गौर भक्तवृंद की जय। श्री श्री राधा कृष्ण गोकुल श्याम कुंड राधा कुंड गिरि गोवर्धन की जय। श्री श्री गौरांगी बैंगलोरेश्वर भगवान की जय। श्री श्री जगन्नाथ बलदेव सुभद्रा में दर्शन भगवान की जय। शिमालपुर धाम की जय। शिवदवन धाम की जय। उनकमयी की जय। यमुनामयी की जय। भक्ति देवी की जय। तुलसी देवी की जय। अनंत कोटि वैष्णव की जय। श्री हरिनाम संकीर्तन की जय। ग्रंथ श्रीमद् भागवतम की जय। इस्कॉन वर्तमान गुरुवंद की जय। समानंद भक्तवंद की जय। गौर प्रेमानंद all glories to the Assembly. All glories to the Assembly. All glories to the Assembly. All glories to the Guru and Gauranga. All glories to Shri Prabhupada ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Aram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswati Vyasam Tato Jayamudithe Nashtaprayeshu Apatreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Sloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtivi. Krishna. So welcome you all to this Friday morning Srimad Bhagavatam class. Today we are discussing from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 22, text 37, 38, 39. We'll go to text 37 first. Sharira manasadibhya vayase cha manushaha bhautikascha katam klesha bhadante harishamsrayam. Sharira manasadibhya vayase cha manushaha bhautikascha katam klesha bhadante harishamsrayam. Sharira manasadibhya vayase ye cha manushaha bhautikascha katam klesha bhadante harishamsrayam. Translation Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Therefore, O Vidura, how can persons completely under the shelter of Lord Krishna in devotional service be put into miseries pertaining to the body, the mind, nature, and other men and living creatures? Every living entity within the material world is always afflicted by some kind of miseries pertaining either to the body, the mind, or natural disturbances. Distresses due to cold in winter and severe heat in summer always inflict miseries on the living entities in this material world, but one who has completely taken shelter of the lotus feet of the Lord in Krishna consciousness is in the transcendental stage. He is not disturbed by any miseries, either due to the body, the mind, or natural disturbances of summer and winter. He is transcendental to all these miseries. Text 38. Yap prishto munibhi praha dharman nana vidan shubhan nrinam varna samanam cha sarvabhuta hita sada. Translation Srila Prabhupada ki jai. In reply to questions asked by certain sages, he, Swayambhuva Manu, out of compassion for all living entities, taught the diverse sacred duties of men in general and the different varnas and asamas. Text 39. Etatta adirajasya manoscharitam adbhutam varnitam varnani yasya tad apatyodayam shuno. Translation Srila Prabhupada ki jai. I have spoken to you of the wonderful character of Swayambhuva Manu, the original king, whose reputation is worthy of description. Please hear as I speak of the flourishing of his daughter Devahuti. Thus, in the Bhaktivedanta purports of the 3rd canto, 22nd chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam, entitled The Marriage of Kardamuni and Devahuti. Om Gyanti Mirandasya Dhananjana Shalakaya Chakshurmitam Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Staptam Ena Bhutale Swayam Rupadamahyam Tadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Vidavadakamilam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sagana Gunatantam Tam Jivam Sadvaitam Samadutam Parjana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Saganalal Shri Vishakan Vidhamscha, He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabantu Jagapade, Gopisa Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Pustade, Taptakan Chanagaurangi Radhe Pinda Paneshwari, Vishabhan Shite Devi Panamami Haripriye, Panchakalpatarubhyasya Gopasindubhya Evacha, Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha, Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nitya Ananda, Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Uham Karudi Vachalam, Pankam Nande, Devim, Kapatam Hamande, Shiburam Danadaru, Paramanda, Shri Chaitanya Vishram. Hare Krishna. So we see here, the last concluding 3 verses, how there are 3 types of miseries. That is, one is Adhyatma, Adhyatmika, Adi Bhautika, and Adi Devika. Adhyatmika, as we have discussed before, are the disturbances caused by body and the mind. Adi Bhautika are the disturbances caused by other living entities. And Adi Devika are the disturbances caused by the nature, material nature, which is none other, comes under the control of the demigods, who are also under the control of the Supreme Lord. We'll understand something about this with some examples. Now, disturbances that are caused by our body and mind are generally there if we see all the time, particularly in Kali Yuga. People are always disturbed. Now, there may be many causes of disturbances. Disturbances in the place of their work or business. Disturbances that may be in the place of education for children. Disturbances within the family. So the mind is always disturbed. And when mind is disturbed, then everything else is also disturbed. But one's intelligence also goes haywire. Similarly, if we see the disturbances caused by other living entities, someone or other will always create a disturbance in our life. Now, we don't know why, how, where they cause disturbances, but we are disturbed by other living entities. And if we see the Adi Devika, every day we have a problem we see in terms of, particularly this verse mentions about how extreme heat, extreme cold in winter and extreme heat in summer. But if you see the exteriors, neither these disturbances were there, but even when they were there, great personalities or devotees of the Lord, they used to be taking austerities, particularly during extreme heat in summer and extreme cold in winter. So that is how the human life is meant to undertake austerities. And without austerity, spiritual life is never possible. But how it is possible is that how one can overcome this is that by taking shelter of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Because ultimately, He is the cause of all causes. If somebody is creating a disturbance for us, maybe because we must understand that we have caused, of course, if you look at, we have also been a cause of disturbance to other living entities, for which sometime in some life or the other, we have to take the reactions for that. If you look at the disturbances in the material nature, it is also a cause because of our own self. Because, for example, when we exploit material nature, we call Earth as Mother Earth. So she's like a mother and who is giving us everything that we want. But we want to exploit these, whatever is available, to the maximum possible extent for our own sense gratification. So as a result, what happens is that the Lord, through the agency of these energies, that is the demigods, arranges for all the disturbances to be caused so that we can learn through the process that they have not to be exploited, but rather whatever is available to us in the material nature, are to be utilized only to keep the body and soul together and not for sense gratification. But the moment we use for sense gratification, then we have to pay a price for that. Now, the current scenario throughout the Earth planet is that people talk about global warming. Now, which is true, until now, places where there were very, very severe cold and winter, those places they have started facing a lot of heat from this year. Similarly, if we see here also, there is a lot of changes in the temperature. Now, this is one of the natural disturbances. There are places where there are a lot of earthquakes. There are places there's a lot of heavy flood of water due to heavy rain. So all these are natural disturbances that are caused by the Lord Himself. One is to make us understand that yes, material nature is not meant for exploitation, but for utilization to the extent that is necessary for keeping this body and soul together, and not for anything beyond that for our own sense gratification. And second thing is that these miseries also show us a way to take shelter of the Lord. So once we take the shelter of the Lord, we must understand that the Lord is always there to protect us. And He is protecting us. In fact, at every moment, He is protecting us. At every moment, through His energies, He is also providing what is required for us based on what we uh, desire and also we deserve. So it is not that we desire something and we get it, but we must also have the qualification for that, for which is called deserve. So the Lord arranges these things. But if we try to understand that I can manipulate material nature, I can also manipulate other living entities, I can also manipulate my own body, my mind, my intelligence for my own sense gratification, then what happens is that the Lord arranges for disturbances through these agencies, that is Adhyatmika, Adhidaivika, Adhibhaudika. If you see, there are many, many examples we might come across in our life. Somebody may be working very, very hard. One of the common problems that we see these days is that people losing a lot of money uh, in terms of lakhs. Some have lost even crores through many online transactions, through online temptations. Somebody gets a message that you have won a lottery for 1 crore. Immediately they try to divulge. The person who says that you have got this, he asks nothing for but accepting your personal information. I'm not into it, but this is the source by which they get this information. When they get this information, then what they happen is that they are very smart in exploiting the people at the other end, and they manipulate so many things. So everybody wants a quick money, whether by means of cheating or by means of exploitation or by means of extortion. These are all very common ways that people use to make quick money. Now, quick money is something that doesn't come. One has to work for it, and whatever one is bound to get by his actions, he will also get his resultant reactions either in terms of reward or suffering. Now, this is not only limited to we human beings here, but it happens everywhere to living entities in the heavenly planets. It also happens to living entities in the hellish planets. Everywhere there is nothing but the suffering of these threefold miseries. In the sixth canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, there is an example when there was a great battle. There is always a battle between the demons and the demigods. So during this battle, once the demigods saw Vritrasura, and the moment they saw his opulence, they were really afraid. Oh, that he's so opulent and he's so powerful and he's got everything. So they all were afraid and they prayed to the Supreme Lord because they also need somebody to protect them. But one thing is that the demigods understand that they are all being devotees of the Lord. They understand that Lord is the only protector for them. So they pray to the Supreme Lord. They say in this particular 6th canto, 9th chapter in the 48th sloka, it says, this living entity in the bodily conception of life is absorbed in the body, which is a combination of the physical elements, the five senses for gathering knowledge, the five senses of action, along with the mind. Through the mind, the living entity suffers three kinds of tribulations, that is Adi Bhautika, Adi Devika, and Adhyatmika. Therefore, this body is a source of all the miseries. So here they are praying to the Lord that whatever sufferings are there is because of the material body. They also have a body, we also have a body, and ant has got a body, a cockroach also has a body. So it is because of the body that we have that we go through these sufferings. And if one understands that this body is temporary, but it has to go through that, then what happens is that then we understand that basically it is the mind concoction of the mind which creates the material conditions. Matter is destructible, but the soul is eternal. The soul does not go through the suffering. It is a material body that goes through the suffering. So if a living entity becomes detached from this material condition and comes to the platform of the Brahman or the spiritual platform, on the platform of the soul, which is what is the spiritual life, then he is in that state of Brahman platform, which is Lord himself says in Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Bhuta Prasannatma na sochati na kankshati. One who is situated on this Brahman platform, he is not worried about the external disturbances. He knows that it is the soul which is eternal and material body is bound to go through the suffering. The Lord also says in Bhagavad Gita, Mamai Vamsa Jiva Loke, Jiva Bhuta Sanatana Manashishindriyani Prakriti Sthani Karshati. The translation it says, the living entities in this conditioned world are my eternal fragmental parts. But due to conditioned life, they are struggling very hard with the six senses, which include the mind. That means everything, whatever our body is nothing but consisting of so many material elements: earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence. But all these are meant for service of the Lord. And when it is utilized in the service of the Lord, one becomes free from the material condition of life. And here in that sloka, it says that due to conditioned life, they are struggling very hard with the six senses, which include the mind. We have a desire to see something for our own sense gratification, we have to suffer. We have a desire to hear something for our own sense gratification, we have to suffer because they are meant to serve the Lord. But if we use for sense gratification, we have to pay the price for it. So, and this thing it is mentioned, purpose, a living entity is actually a part and parcel of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and is unaffected by material conditions. But because the mind is affected, the senses are affected, and the living entity struggles for existence within this material world. So basically, what happens is that the soul is not affected by disturbances of the material nature or all these threefold miseries, but it is the mind that is disturbed. And when the mind is affected, then what happens is that the senses are affected. And the conclusion is that the living entity struggles for existence within this material world. So this is how we all struggle. And this example is given to understand that yes, we are all going through this struggle. Even the demigods go through the struggle, and every living entity also has to go through this struggle because we all think that this mind is mine, this body is mine, the intelligence is mine. That is our false ego. There is another example given in the sixth canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, where King Chitraketu, he had no son. So that is the time when Narad Muni and Angir Rishi came, and they gave instructions that this living entity in this bodily conception of life is absorbed in a body which is combination of physical elements, the five senses for gathering knowledge, five senses for action, along with the mind. Through the mind, the living entity suffers three kinds of tribulations. So the same this thing that yes, whatever suffering we have, we suffer due to our mind. Sometimes we may feel I must struggle very hard, but I must buy a house. Now that buying a house, it creates a big disturbances in our mind. All the entire energy that we have got, of course, a house may be required for our sustenance, for our living. But what happens is that when we orient our all our material energy for that, then what happens is that we work for that, and to achieve that, sometimes we are even tempted to uh, exploit the material energy by through the process of trying to gather wealth through unusual or unorganized or uh, by other means which is not authorized in the scriptures. So what happens is that we pay a price for that. After that also, for example, we have bought a house. It is not very easy to maintain it these days. One has to struggle. So this is how the mind becomes the cause of suffering, and the mind also is the cause of uh, giving the happiness, which is also temporary in this material world. There is no happiness of the material platform in this material world, which is eternal, because the material world is not eternal. We, this material body is not eternal, and the process is not eternal. So what happens is that we have to suffer for this. In the fifth canto, Sri Sukadeva Goswami is telling Parikshit Maharaj, being unable to protect himself from the threefold miseries of material existence, the conditioned soul becomes very morose and lives a life of lamentation. So that means when we go through these sufferings of these threefold miseries, then what happens is that we become morose and we think we live a life of lamentation. So what happens is that first and the foremost, we have a hankering for something, and when we have a hankering, something goes wrong in the process. After we get it, then we start lamenting, because when we have a disturbance, even after acquiring something, then we start lamenting. Finally, what happens is that we start thinking, why did I have to struggle for all these things? This is how the whole creation of the material world is. It's also mentioned that these three miseries are suffered by mental calamity at the hands of the demigods, such as freezing wind and scorching heat. So it is a mental concoction that we develop in the process of this uh, uh, engagement, that we engage in sense gratification, and finally there is no escape and we always lament. So finally, Sukadeva Goswami is concluding telling Parikshit Maharaj, the conditioned soul suffers many miserable bodily conditions, such as being affected by severe cold and strong winds. He also suffers due to the activities of other living beings and due to natural disturbances. When he is unable to counteract them and has to remain in a miserable condition, he naturally becomes morose, and because he wants to enjoy material facilities. So we have a tendency that we want to enjoy all the material facilities that are available, and in the process we are being exploited. We we have to suffer for all these things. So suffering is there in this material world, and one has to go through. But if one takes shelter of the Supreme Lord, then he understands that he is not this material body, he is not this mind, he is not this intelligence, because above the senses are the mind, above the mind is the intelligence, and above intelligence is the soul. So if we understand properly that we are not this body but we are a soul, then we can practice, have a proper way of understanding self-realization. But the intelligence for which one should use the right intelligence. In the 11th canto, also in the Srimad Bhagavatam, there is a mention. Within this material world, one's body is always subject to birth and decay. Similarly, the life air is harassed by hunger and thirst. The mind is always anxious. The intelligence hankers for that which cannot be obtained, and all the senses are ultimately exhausted by constant struggle in the material nature. So if we see here, our life here is harassed by hunger and thirst. So if not, there is nothing, if we don't have any other desire also, still what happens is that Our body, when it becomes old, it is harassed by hunger and thirst. So as a result of which, what happens is that the mind is always anxious. See, there is nobody who does not have an anxiety. They are always anxious. And then what happens is that that intelligence that we have, it hankers for that which cannot be obtained. So there is a constant struggle in this material nature. But a person who is not bewildered by the inevitable miseries of material existence and who remains aloof from them simply by remembering the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is to be considered a Bhagavata Pradhana or the foremost devotee of the Lord. So one who understands that this material, that whatever temptations, they're all very rosy, very nice to look at. But if one understands that they are all temporary by nature, and if one tries to acquire that, they have to go through a very constant struggle, and then one has to pay the price in terms of suffering. But one who remains aloof from them simply by remembering the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is considered the foremost devotee of the Lord. So the point is that if one takes shelter of the devotee of the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord, then he becomes free from this type of lamentation. There is also a very nice quote in Srimad Bhagavatam, which mentions that there are three classes of people. One is the ordinary human being and the demons, and then there are the demigods. It is mentioned that of these three classes, the ordinary human beings and demons are terribly afflicted by birth, death, and hunger, whereas the godly persons, the demigods, are aloof from such bodily distress. Now, if you understand here, it's not that the demigods don't have suffering, but being devotees of the Lord, they also go through the suffering, but they understand that the Lord is there to protect them. But we human beings, because we don't take shelter, and also those with a demoniac mentality, they go through the suffering because they think that they can go through this distress on their and take shelter on their own self, which is our false ego. We have nothing to do. We cannot take protection of our own self. How can we protect others? So this is the understanding that is given in the Srimad Bhagavatam, but the demigods don't have this type of suffering that human beings go through or even demoniac people go through because we depend on our own self. But the godly persons such as the demigods are aloof from such bodily distress. Now, the demigods, it mentioned that they remain aloof from such distress because they are enjoying the results of their pious activities by the laws of karma. They are unaware of the gross suffering of this material world. So they also go through the suffering, but they are unaware because they are trying to enjoy the happiness due to the law of karma. Nobody gets the position of a demigod as it is. They get the position by a lot of pious activities, by which they may go to heavenly planets and we take up the position of a demigod. So, but after the results of those pious activities are over, then they have also to leave their position, which is not very easy. If you see today, a big personality like a president or a prime minister or a chief minister, it is not very easy for them to leave the post which they have because they live in that atmosphere of opulence and they don't want to leave it because they are enjoying that opulence. But all that opulence that the demigods see or experience is also due to their pious karma in their previous lives for which they are enjoying. But they have an understanding that everything here is temporary and they are always there to take shelter of the Lord, which we don't have as human beings or those with demoniac experience. The conclusion is that the pure devotee of the Lord, however, does not experience material misery because he has given up the bodily concept of life and identifies himself as the eternal servitor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So this is how a pure devotee actually has surpassed that stage of material miseries. He understands Yes, I'm not this body and I'm not here to exploit material nature. That is a very nice quote by Madhvacharya also. In one of the slokas, he says, the translation is, even if a devotee is frustrated in his attempt to eat properly or clothe himself properly, he should not allow this material failure to disturb his mind. Rather, he should use his intelligence to remember his master, Lord Krishna, and thus remain undisturbed. So, here Madhvacharya also quotes that because even if we are disturbed, one should not allow this material failure to disturb our mind, which is the cause of the disturbance that we experience. But if one uses his intelligence to remember his master, Lord Krishna, then he remains undisturbed. So as one becomes mature in this process of remembering Krishna, in all circumstances, he is awarded the title Mahabhagavata. So that means we have to, that should be our goal, and that should be a process also. Also, there is a very nice quote that one who chants the holy name of the Lord is immediately freed from the reactions of unlimited sins, even if he chants indirectly, jokingly, for musical entertainment, or even neglectfully. This is accepted by all the learned scholars of the scriptures. So even if we take shelter of the Lord by mistake, by jokingly, or even unwillingly or neglectfully, then the Lord arranges in a way that we become purified of that contamination and we take shelter of the Lord. Actually, the Lord Himself tells Uddhava in the 11th canto, He says the conditioned soul who remains dependent on fruitive activities under the modes of material nature will continue to fear me, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, since I impose the results of one's fruitive activity. That means the Lord is telling Uddhava, Uddhava is a very dear devotee of the Lord. He is telling Uddhava that these conditioned souls who remain dependent on fruitive activity, that means we depend on this fruitive. What is fruitive activity? We are expecting result out of that activity which we perform, and we want to use that result for our sense gratification. So such a person, the Lord says, will continue to fear me. That means we are always afraid because he says, I impose the results of one's fruitive activities. It's the Lord who gives the result of these activities through his agency, who are the demigods. Those who accept the material concept of life, he says, taking the variegatedness of the modes of nature to be factual, devote themselves to material enjoyment, and therefore are always absorbed in lamentation and grief. So, this is a declaration given by the Lord Himself, where He says this material concept of life, taking the variegatedness. Variegatedness means we see a lot of varieties. Today, we might see, for example, any object. We might see a scooter. Now, it might be very, very attractive. But what happens after 3 years, that scooter is not attractive because something else has come up, which many attractive features. Similarly, if you look at anything in this material world, they become very, very attractive to us and we want to acquire that. But what happens is that we devote ourselves to material enjoyment and therefore we are absorbed in lamentation and grief. And in the process, we experience suffering through our mind. But the ultimate point that mentioned in these slokas is that one has to take shelter of the Supreme Lord, and the process is by trying to start the process of hearing and chanting. In the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, in the 7th chapter, there's a mention how Srila Vyasadeva, he was actually sitting on the bank of Saraswati River and he was meditating on the Lord, and he thought that these material miseries of the living entity, which are superfluous to him, can be directly mitigated by the linking process of devotional service. That means Sri Vasudeva contemplated that the living entities are suffering, but this suffering can be mitigated by the linking process. That means yoga or the linking process by which we connect to the Lord, and that happens how? by devotional service. But the mass of people did not know this, and therefore it is mentioned that the learned Vyasadeva compiled a Vedic literature, which is in relation to the supreme truth. Srila Vyasadeva actually could see the living entities suffering, but they did not know the cause of suffering. And therefore, he compiled this Vedic literature known as Srimad Bhagavatam. And the subsequent verse, he says, simply by giving oral reception to the Vedic literature, the feeling for loving devotional service to Lord Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, sprouts up at once. They extinguish the fire of lamentation, illusion, and fearfulness. So, the solution that he's giving is that one has to give an oral reception to this Vedic literature, by which we start getting a feeling of loving devotional service to Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And when one sprouts, that devotional service sprouts up in one's in a living entity, then what happens is that he extinguishes the fire of lamentation, illusion, and fearfulness. So these are three things that always affect us. That is, we lament. We are every moment we are lamenting for something which does not belong to us. The second thing is we always see illusion. We see so many objects which are illusory in nature. And the third thing is we always are afraid of other living entities, other disturbances. These three things always keep affecting us at every moment of time, and every situation, every circumstance. We are always disturbed by these three. Therefore, when we are disturbed, then our mind is anxious, and the only way to take is that use our right intelligence by understanding the words of the Lord or his pure devotees, and take shelter at the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord. Now here, the conclusion that is mentioned in the first sloka is that every living entity is afflicted, but one who is not disturbed by these miseries is transcendental. He becomes transcendental. Transcendental is beyond the three modes of material nature. The three modes of material nature are responsible for creating the threefold miseries, that is Adhyatmika, Adibhautika, and Adidevika. But if one transcends beyond these three, which is a transcendental situation, then one becomes free. So Srimad Bhagavatam gives example of these great personalities from which we should learn and try to practice our own self. And one of the great personalities that this particular chapter and this slokas mentioned is an example of Swayambhuva Manu. Swayambhuva Manu, as we have discussed before also, he is also one who takes birth in this material world, and he is directly born from none other than Lord Brahma. Lord Brahma is the first living entity who is created. Then Swayambhuva Manu and others, Prajapatis, take birth. Now Swayambhuva Manu gives an example, as we have discussed before. His birth was also great because they are all great devotees of the Lord. And in the last class, I gave an example of how he lived in a very opulent atmosphere, and how they utilized everything in the service of the Lord by waking up by waking up the Lord, by waking up themselves, they remembered the glories of the Lord. And every day, even before going to bed, they were hearing about the glories of the Lord. So this is how these great personalities were. And not only were they greatly experienced, and they did not go through the type of sufferings that we go through, but if you see here, the second question, sloka that we discussed, is mentioned on how Swayambhuva Manu replied to questions asked by sages out of compassion for all the living entities, taught the diverse sacred duties of men in general and the different varnas and ashramas. So the Lord has given this varnashrama system, established the varnashrama system also, so that we adopt those practices of varnashrama system, and by that we become purified. That is also there. Now, Swayambhuva Manu, he had this compassion for all the living entities. Now, if you see these great devotees of the Lord, they all have a lot of compassion. And he not only practiced himself, but he taught the diverse sacred duties of men in general. In fact, the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam also mentions that Parikshit Maharaj asked Sukadeva Goswami, what is the duty of a person in general and what is the duty of a person who is about to die? So the whole Srimad Bhagavatam, if you look at, it is all about question and answer, question and answer, question and answer. So this is the process of spiritual life. Spiritual life means asking a question and getting an answer for that. And Swayambhava Manu practiced himself and he had the compassion. If you see whether it is Lord Brahma, the Supreme Lord himself, or the other Prajapatis like Swayambhava Manu, they all had the compassion for living entities. Through their own life, they set perfect examples. And they also gave instructions to other living entities also, like great sages and others who were responsible personalities in the society. If you see the rishis are also interested in the welfare of mankind. Similarly, all these great personalities, they always think of what is good for mankind and they teach us through the scriptures. So that is why it is always said that one should go take shelter of Sadhu, Shastra, and Guru. One can understand the scripture only through a Guru or a Sadhu. And they also explain about the duties in general and about the different varnas and ashramas. And the last sloka mentions as to how wonderful was the character of Swayambhuva Manu, who was the original king whose reputation is worthy of description. So, and then it mentioned, please hear as I speak of the flourishing of his daughter Devahuti. Now, when we hear and understand the glories of these great personalities, definitely it has will have some impetus in us also. Sometimes we may think, I know this, I know that, I know this particular, I've heard so many times. But if we have, the question is, if we have heard so many times, so many of these past times, why there is no effect on us? Because it has become a mechanical process. So we should not understand these like any other storybook or any other literature. But if you take seriously in our life and apply the lessons in our life, then definitely we also become free from these three material miseries. But also we will be also developing the compassion. Yes, it is not only me. Let us see how we see how other living entities are suffering, and we may be able to give them these instructions like the way Swayambhuva Manu is giving to other living entities and sages. So the point is that one should try to become free from the material mental aspect, which is the mind, which is the cause of suffering. Now, Swayambhuva Manu, it was not only himself that he set an example. If you look at the others who took birth in his family or in his dynasty, they were all great exemplary personalities. And in this Srimad Bhagavatam, there is a conversation between Vidura and Maitreya, where Vidura is asking Maitreya, the lion of Swayambhuva Manu was most esteemed, O worshipful sage. I beg you to give me an account of this race whose progeny multiplied through sexual intercourse. Now, here, Vidura is asking Maitreya about Swayambhuva Manu, in which in the purport, Srila Prabhupada mentioned that regulated sex life to generate good population is worthy accepting. And actually, Vidura was not interested in hearing the history of persons who merely engaged in sex life, but he was interested in the progeny of Swayambhuva Manu, because in that dynasty, great devotee kings appeared who protected their subjects very carefully with spiritual knowledge. That means Vidura also, it is mentioned, was interested in hearing about Swayambhuva Manu because Swayambhuva Manu did not live a life of sense gratification. Therefore, great kings appeared in his dynasty and they all became, they were all great devotees of the Lord. This progeny of Swayambhuva Manu and his sons were approved by great authorities. That means authorities, Manu is none other than Swayambhuva Manu is one of the Mahajanas. So these Mahajanas are all authorities when it comes to devotional service to the Lord. So great personalities appeared in that dynasty. Swayambhuva Manu had two sons. One was Priyavrata and other was Uttanapada. And they ruled the world consisting of 7 islands just according to religious principles. They did not deviate from religious principles, but they ruled as per the Sadhu Shastra and Guru. Now, if you see the Priyavrata, we already discussed, but as far as Uttanapada is concerned, from his dynasty came Dhruva Maharaj. Now, Dhruva Maharaj was a very great devotee of the Lord, and he performed a lot of austerities, which is mentioned in the 4th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. And he somehow, due to circumstances, his stepmother did not allow him to sit in the lap of his father. But his mother told him that you perform austerities. And he went to the forest at a very early age, at 5 years. And he performed so many austerities that even demigods were afraid, and they went to the Supreme Lord asking what is the reason that the whole breathing air has come to a standstill. That is the way he performed austerities. And when he performed these austerities, the Lord, being pleased with him, revealed himself to Dhruva Maharaj, and he asked him to go back. And so when he went back, Swayambhuva Manu himself was very pleased, and Uttanapada was very pleased, and Uttanapada at the right time handed over his kingdom to his son when he was just 5 years old. And Dhruva Maharaj ruled the kingdom again based on religious principles. And at a very young age, he had, so Dhruva Maharaj actually left his palace to perform austerities because of his stepmother. And it so happened that his stepmother's stepbrother got killed by one of the Yakshas. So Dhruva Maharaj, because of his stepbrother for whom he left his palace to perform austerities, when he realized that his stepbrother was killed by one of the Yakshas, he went to fight a great battle. And that battle, it lasted, it was a very severe battle. Dhruva Maharaj also fought in that battle so very vigorously against these Yakshas that sometimes demigods were wondering whether Dhruva Maharaj is going to lose. But then he was empowered by the Lord. He used whatever empowerment was there to defeat all these Yakshas. But what happened was, he started killing these Yakshas out of his this thing. But at one point of time, Swayambhuva Manu thought that no, what he is doing is killing many others, whereas only one Yaksha killed his stepbrother. So Swayambhuva Manu actually comes and gives a lot of practical lessons to Dhruva Maharaj, even after the kingdom was handed over to Dhruva Maharaj by his own father, Uttanapada. And in that, some of those lessons, some valuable inputs are there, which we don't have the time to discuss. But Swayambhuva Manu says that all that we see in this material world are temporary, all related to the material body only. So Swayambhuva Manu actually gives a lot of instructions which are very, very valuable on the same lines. So the point is that Swayambhuva Manu set an example right from his birth, even at the time of his living, the way he lived, and also even after he handed over his kingdom to his sons, who in turn handed over to his grandsons, of which Dhruva Maharaj was an exemplary example. So these are all the things that we can learn from this particular chapter, and we come to an end with the conclusion that the next chapter, the qualities of Swayambhuva Manu's daughter Devahuti is being discussed as to how great she was also as a devotee of the Lord. So with this, I conclude the class for the day. I can take some questions, some comments, if anyone has got. The most important point is that these kings or the rulers, they never accepted a position for sense gratification. That is why they were called Raja Rishis. Raja Rishi means king as well as saintly person. A saintly person is one who understands the life is not meant for sense gratification. And through their life, they have given us examples. Thank you. Anybody who's got any questions, comments on these points? If there are no questions or comments, can I leave? Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Prabhuji, for the wonderful class.
Thank you, Babu.
Thank you, Prabhuji.
I think there are no questions, so can I leave, Prabhu?
Yes, Prabhuji, if there are no questions, we can wind up. Dear devotees, any questions, comments?
Looks like there are no questions, Prabhu.
Okay, Prabhuji. Thank you, Prabhuji.
Thank you very much.
Pranam.
Thank you all very much. Thank you all very much. Granthad Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.